Greetings, friends of liberty. When I look around me today, and from this vantage point, from this promontory, almost at the headwaters of the 19th century, survey the 17th and 18th, I can only marvel at how enlightened we've become. Especially we English, of course, but even across the Channel, those delicate escargot eaters, or across the Rhine, the more indelicate bratwurst munchers, and even over the Alps, those gorging themselves on lasagna and polenta, focaccia and carbonara, struggle though they all have intellectually, they too, amidst their lunching and supping, have managed some measure of enlightenment. Now, undoubtedly, one of the foremost issues when we examine our enlightenment and the accompanying and overlapping scientific revolution is the question of their origins. Why, pray tell, has this extraordinary increase in human knowledge and productivity occurred? Well, certainly without doubt, one reason remains self-evident: the Reformation. With the Reformation, the stranglehold that the Popish Church held on European and English science and philosophy was released. Yes, that Church of Rome, who had killed Giordano Bruno, setting him aflame on the Campo di Fiore, and who threatened Galileo and Copernicus with a similar bonfire, and tortured or inflamed other less famous thinkers. That church that hated science and philosophy, since they disproved their illogical dogmas. That church, that engine of fanaticism, thank God, was rudely expelled from England, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Holland, and parts of Germany. Its death grip even loosened in Frogland. The result? Starting a few decades later, the appearance of Galileo, Kepler, Copernicus, Bacon, Gassendi, Newton, and Leibniz, and the philosophies of Spinoza, Descartes, Hobbes, and Locke. Are scientists and philosophers able to breathe the air of freedom once more? Which leads us to the crux of the biscuit. First came the increased protection of property rights, the lives of all those scientists, that they wouldn't be reduced to a smoking human hulk. And then came their science, utterly logical. Who would want to be burnt to a crisp as a reward for having discovered the laws of motion or universal gravitation? Or that the Earth revolves around the Sun, or that Jupiter has moons, and the Moon craters? That knowledge all came after the prospect or actuality of increased rights protections. Now, if we turn to the issue of the origins of enlightenments, both those past, present, and those in your own 21st century in the West and America, we find today a book which exactly defends the Enlightenment and bids to inform us of how to become even more enlightened. Dr. Steven Pinker, longtime faculty member at Harvard, which, as we shall see, both helps and hurts him, here, in essence, is presenting a theory of civilization, of which his theory of the Enlightenment is an integral part. Dr. Pinker begins, much as he did his previous 880-page tome, The Better Angels of Our Nature, by swamping the reader with a tsunami of information, data, and statistical tables to make the exact same argument for Western Civ that the French hypnotherapist Emil Coue made way back around 1920, with his following positive affirmation and hypnotic autosuggestion. Every day, in every way, I'm getting better and better. Is Western Civ getting better and better? Let's examine what Pinker says, but first, see his definition. According to him, quoting Kant, the Enlightenment motto is dare to understand, and its foundational demand is freedom of thought and speech. In addition, he says, foremost is reason. Reason is non-negotiable. Also emblematic of Enlightenment thought was its sympathy for others, with thinkers not only condemning religious violence, but also the secular cruelties of their age, including slavery, despotism, and executions for frivolous offenses such as shoplifting and poaching. Having seen his definition, on an introductory biological level, Dr. Pinker notes the existence of entro, evo, info. In other words, entropy, the world in its original chaotic state that needs to be brought into some order, like when we build a house. Evo, evolution, of the human mind, such as our increasing brain size and capacities. And info, the information that our minds and brains gathers and stores. Let's turn now to more purely civilizational aspects. He claims that one of the foundational problems of maintaining civilization is that humans today rely on cognitive faculties that work well enough in traditional societies, but which we now see are infested with bugs. Some of these bugs, he posits, are religious faith and nationalism, but believes we overcome these by the fact that thanks to language, ideas are not just abstracted and combined inside the head of a single thinker, but can be pooled across a community of thinkers. And so he concludes that, for all the flaws of human nature, it contains the seeds of its own improvement. Pinker appears to believe, ironically, that it's one of the bugs of human nature to think reality worse than it is. For example, the rate of homicide plummeted after the Middle Ages, and it's a commonplace among international relations scholars that major wars tapered off after 1945. But they come as a surprise to most people in the wider world. This he calls a negativity bias, and so he counters it with facts. Number one, while the life expectancy of hunter-gatherers is around 32.5 years, that of modern humans is 71. In fact, so much progress in extending human longevity was made during the 20th century alone that the average person approached death by just 7 months for every year they aged. Number two, the rate of child mortality plunged 100-fold to a fraction of a percentage point in developed countries, and the plunge went global. Number three, until recently, about 1% of mothers died in the process. For an American woman, being pregnant a century ago was almost as dangerous as having breast cancer today. Mortality during pregnancy and birth declining 300-fold from 1.2 to 0.004%. Number four, in the mid-19th century, it took 25 men a full day to harvest and thresh a ton of grain. Today, one person operating a combine harvester can do it in 6 minutes. Number five, due to the so-called Green Revolution, started in part by agronomist Norman Borlaug, between 1961 and 2009, the amount of land used to grow food increased by 12%, but the amount of food that was grown increased by 300%. Number six, in 1919, an average American wage earner had to work 1,800 hours to pay for a refrigerator. In 2014, he or she had to work fewer than 24 hours, and the new fridge was frost-free and came with an ice maker. As a result of such advances in household appliances, the amount of life that people lost to housework fell almost fourfold from 58 hours a week in 1960 to 15 hours in 2011. So what has caused all these increases in human well-being? Pinker argues science, good institutions, by which he means liberal, better morality, and the free trade of globalization. So, for example, in 2005, the economist Jason Furman estimated that Walmart, essentially shuttling goods from China to the U.S., saved the typical American family $2,300 a year. On the issue of whether inequality is increased and whether that's necessarily bad, he points out that even if the poorer 50% of the population still have only 5% of total global net worth, the absolute size of that 5% has increased enormously. And what actually increases equality? Disasters of all kind. Mass mobilization warfare, World War I and II, transformative revolution, the French Revolution, state collapse, the Dark Ages, and lethal pandemics, the Black Plague. And resources in the modern world are not running out, but generally being discovered at the rate they need to be, with more discovered when the need gets more urgent. That's why you never hear anything anymore about peak oil, and partly why deforestation of the world's largest tropical forest, the Amazon, peaked in 1995, and from 2004 to 2013, the rate fell by 4/5. At this point, Dr. Pinker transitions into talking about climate change, noting that the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere has risen from about 270 parts per million before the Industrial Revolution to more than 400 parts today. He believing, because of this, that the temperature could rise to 4 degrees Celsius, 7.2 degrees Fahrenheit. He claims that this will result in many bad environmental and climatological consequences, arguing that island nations would disappear beneath the waves, large stretches of farmland would no longer be arable, and millions of people would be displaced. His solution? To keep the rise to 2 degrees Celsius or less, the world would have to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions by half or more by the middle of the 21st century and eliminate them altogether before the turn of the 22nd century. Humanity has never faced a problem like it. How should we do that? He wants a tax on carbon, claiming that almost every analyst endorses it as a prerequisite to dealing with climate change. But he doesn't explain how the West would get the rest of the world, the biggest polluters like China, India, and many other countries, to go along with a tax. Fortunately, the developed world is actually decarbonizing, as we're seeing in the U.S. with the widespread adoption of low-carbon natural gas that has accompanied the fracking boom. He also discusses various geoengineering proposals to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. Among some of the other topics he discusses are, number one, natural disasters. The dangers of many types of natural disasters are obviously reduced by technology and greater wealth. A typical example being a 2010 earthquake in Haiti, with all their flimsy shelters, killed more than 2,000 people, while a stronger one in Chile a few weeks later killed just 500. Number two, terrorism. The number of deaths in the U.S. from terrorism is low, but I suspect he discounts or disregards the many quasi-terroristic Islamic religious crimes occurring in less developed countries. He says, however, that Western Europe and the U.S., despite containing 10% of the world's population, in 2015 suffered 0.5% of the terrorist deaths. Number three, the spread of democracy. Democracies indicate the advance of civilization, having, compared to other forms of government, higher rates of economic growth, fewer wars and genocides, healthier and better educated citizens, and virtually no famines. The last major wave of democratization involved the following countries: Greece, 1974, Spain, 75, Portugal, 76, Argentina, 83, Brazil, 85, Taiwan and the Philippines, 86, South Korea, 87, Chile, 1990, Indonesia, 1998, Croatia, 2000, Serbia, 2000, Georgia, 2003, Ukraine, 2004, and Kyrgyzstan, 2005. Updated to 2015, that means democracies embraced 56% of the world's population, compared with 7% in 1850 and 1% in 1816. Number four, to wrap up some of the rest of his other arguments, on loneliness, Dr. Pinker says, citing stats, there is no loneliness epidemic in America, which is not in agreement with my understanding or experience. On suicide, he dismisses the recent per capita increase in the American suicide rates for both males and females as being comparatively small historically. On AI, he argues that AI will, in the end, likely be highly beneficial for humanity, and that there is little danger of it taking over the world, with which I agree. On computer hackers and bioweapon villains, he points out they haven't done anything catastrophic yet, and given how many good guys are focused on stopping them, they're not likely to. On nuclear war, while he argues that the risks of full-blown nuclear confrontation are overblown, he agrees that the risks of a hair-trigger response between superpowers are a very real danger. And finally, he believes that the authoritarian populism that leaders like Donald Trump represent is a growing existential threat to America, saying that Trump is a protectionist who sees international trade as a zero-sum contest between countries, that Trump is an admirer of Vladimir Putin, and lamenting Trump's repetition of ludicrous conspiracy theories. So in conclusion, what's the upshot of all this? Well, when I started the book, I was afraid he would use the exact same approach as he did in his 880-page Better Angels of Our Nature. And unfortunately, that's exactly what he's done. He hasn't changed at all since 2015, neither the good nor the bad, which is why I'd give him a BB-. Dr. Pinker understands 100%, no question about it, that the acquisition of knowledge is one of the drivers of human progress. As he says in the book's final sentence, there is no limit to the betterments we can attain if we continue to apply knowledge to enhance human flourishing. This is true. But the problem is, he thinks it's the only driver. So his weakness is in not understanding that there is another driver, just as important to the growth of civilization, the protection of property rights. Here, although he certainly doesn't believe in violence overall, he's not consistent in understanding that protecting property rights always works and is just as important. Why? Because by protecting property rights, you make sure that individuals face the natural consequences of their actions in everything they do. And when you do that, you reward people who A, get the most knowledge, and B, use it most productively, which is exactly what you want. Violating rights, on the other hand, never does that. This misunderstanding of his comes out in numerous ways. So, for example, he makes extended arguments arguing for the welfare state, saying countries that combine free markets with more taxation, social spending, and regulation than the United States turn out to be not grim dystopias, but rather pleasant places to live, and they trounce the United States in every measure of human flourishing. I can hardly imagine a more ignorant statement from such a smart man. We see right in front of our eyes the United States and many Western countries going bankrupt. Do you imagine, Dr. Pinker, that the greatest Ponzi scheme in world history, the Social Security Trust Fund, might be a reason? Maybe? And the huge unfunded liabilities of government Medicare and Medicaid? And the disaster of Obamacare? And when he says approvingly that education is compulsory in most countries and is recognized as a fundamental human right by 170 members of the United Nations, I would reply that American public subsidies of lower and higher education have caused college and elementary school costs to skyrocket, while offering no increases in learning, reading, or math scores for a half century. Documented. As well as in creating woke and many other ideologies. And so when he says the facts of human progress strike me as having been unkind to right-wing libertarianism, I'd answer, you're blind to the present harms. And in addition, just wait a few more years and we'll see how well your welfare state institutions will have turned out when we're all bankrupt. Perhaps this is why, as he himself admits, the average annual growth of American GDP is now only about 0.6% annually, when it used to be, without much regulation, 2 to 3 times as large. And on the eastern side of the Atlantic, all anyone has to do is look at the UK and see how badly the NHS, skyrocketing housing costs, sky-high energy prices with net zero, national insurance, and state broadcasting have turned out. Let's look at a few more of his faux pas. Number 1, trying to denigrate the nation state, which usually exists to protect property rights, He says, between 1803 and 1945, the world tried an international order based on nation-states heroically struggling for greatness. It didn't turn out so well. What he misunderstands is that when nations are nationalistic, wanting to violate the rights of other nations, as they were from 1914 to 1945, then it turns out badly. But from 1803 to 1914, when Western civilization was mainly patriotic, not nationalistic, it saw an extraordinary flourishing, virtually unparalleled in world history. Number 2. Dr. Pinker, being so ignorant about economics, but wanting a solution to climate change, doesn't understand that simply letting the world economy be completely free market would offer the best hope. Get government out of fusion research, for example. This type of freedom is exactly why the United States, having a relatively free energy sector, developed fracking, a very positive step in reducing carbon emissions. And it is precisely why decriminalizing nuclear energy would lead to an even greater reduction in carbon emissions. Freedom and free markets, not the garbage solutions of net zero and Biden's green energy policies, offer humanity the best chance to rationally and profitably reduce carbon emissions. Number 3. Another fundamental misunderstanding he has is about how slavery was abolished. He thinking, as a good liberal, that people somehow simply got more moral, stamped their foot down, and insisted the practice be discontinued. And so he says about the abolition of slavery that it would be like listing in the achievements section of a resume that you overcame a heroin addiction. That's funny, as Dr. Pinker is many times in this book, but completely wrong. How slavery was abolished was the following. Imagine, God forbid, that you were a passenger on a sinking ocean liner, and after the ship had gone under, you swam to a plank that could only support one person, that was already supporting another person. Having no other alternative, you knocked the person off, then holding on through the night until rescue came. Now instead, imagine that when you came upon that person, you saw another plank 50 feet away. There are 2 planks. Then you could swim to that plank, and both you and the other person would live. That was how slavery was abolished. Becoming richer and richer, Western civilization gave people more and more options existentially, so it was no longer necessary and rational to enslave others, who often had, for example, tried to wipe out your entire village, which meant the best alternative was not killing them all or letting them escape to try again 5 years later, but instead enslaving them. Pinker just thinks it was purely a case of the morally superior people, like those who attend Harvard and live in Cambridge, Massachusetts, finally having summoned enough outrage to make laws outlawing slavery. So, happy for my part that we 18th century English understand very well, as Dr. Pinker doesn't, how important the protection of property rights is to the growth and progress of science and civilization. I bid you well, and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.